Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming to the last colloquium of our series for the Department of Counselor Education and Counseling Psychology for this year. This is our last meeting, and boy, the year went fast. Almost the end of the semester, and we have only, I think, maybe 2 or 3 more blizzards, probably. So. But we're in a room with no windows, so we aren't reminded of what the weather's like. I'm Tim Melchert. I'm coordinating the colloquium series for this year in our department. And thank you very much for coming. We have a very interesting and important talk today. And I'm very pleased to welcome John Schmid, who is a journalist with the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, to deliver the last colloquium of the series. And John has been at the Journal Sentinel since 2003. Before that, he was with the Associated Press in Europe and the International Herald Tribune in Europe. And John is going to talk today on his recent series that's called A Time to Heal. It's appeared in the front pages of the Milwaukee Journal multiple times over the past year. It's a multimedia, multiple segment approach that's getting a lot of attention here in Milwaukee, but it's also getting some national attention. And in this series, John explores how childhood trauma can lead to poverty, mental illness, school dropout, crime, unemployment, and a self-repeating intergenerational cycle. Importantly, however, his series also focuses on recovery and resilience and healing. So John is changing the conversation around these issues in Milwaukee. He's directing attention to the causes of problems of people who are struggling, and particularly the people who are struggling with all of the economic dislocation that's rocked industrial cities like Milwaukee ever since we lost so much manufacturing over the past 50 years. And part of the reason that I think his work is so important is that he is using an evidence-based approach to making these arguments. As opposed to, for instance, relying on political arguments that sometimes can be very polarizing and may not lead to solutions. But instead, he's focusing on the data about what people are actually dealing with and struggling with. And you can often get quite a different picture of circumstances that can be very effective in terms of leading towards solutions. His evidence-based approach also resulted in comparing the experience in urban centers in the state of Wisconsin to experience in rural areas. And you can get a very different approach again when you make those kinds of comparisons. Now, there's others who are also in helping to change the conversation around these issues in Milwaukee. Many of you know that Dr. Lovell, the president of Marquette, and his wife Amy Lovell are very interested in these issues and have taken note of John's work and are championing these causes here in Milwaukee. Also, you may have noticed that Oprah Winfrey has taken notice of this work as well. She's put a spotlight on this just recently. Oprah Winfrey spent much of her childhood in Milwaukee, and she experienced some pretty extreme poverty, abuse, lots of challenges. Obviously, she's been tremendously successful in overcoming those challenges and is now one of the most influential, well, some people call her the most influential woman in the United States. Some have said she's the most influential woman in the world right now. And she heard about John's work with the Journal Sentinel in this series, A Time to Heal, and just, I think within the last month, did a segment for 60 Minutes on the topic. And congratulations, John. I don't know if you can get any greater recognition as a journalist than to have Oprah take note. John has also received formal recognition for his work. In fact, just last week, he received a highly prestigious award from the National Press Foundation. He is the 2017 winner of the Carolyn C. Mattingly Award for Mental Health Reporting, and for the work that he's going to talk about today. So, very pleased to have you join us, John. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Thank you, Professor. I am very honored to be invited to give a lecture at the same university where I was so proud to call myself a research fellow through the Lubar Center for Public Policy Research at the Marquette Law School. That fellowship was quintessential for the findings I'll be presenting. As Tim mentioned, a lot of folks who see these stories categorize them as mental health reporting, and they turned out to be that. But that's a very new topic for me because I'm an economics journalist, and much of what I'm going to talk about today is economics. I like stories about globalization and economic change, and this is one of them. But this project did take my reporting in a very unexpected direction and gave me new metrics and new ways to make sense of downward social and economic spirals. The project began with questions that were economic. This beautiful city, based on what you're going to see, the word beautiful doesn't always come up, but it is, I love this city so much. I've never seen a city with a prettier shoreline. But the questions that we had to deal with in Milwaukee and similar cities are, why the urban economies become so dysfunctional and so unresponsive to decades and decades of conventional interventions. Poverty and distress in this city have kept perpetuating in an unrelenting dynamic, despite no ends of nonprofits and government programs. You could go back 50 years, not the war on poverty in the 60s, not the urban empowerment zones of the 90s, not the countless make-work jobs programs, not the subsidized job training programs, not the upswings in the national economy, not the tech booms. Nothing seemed to move the needle in Milwaukee and cities like it. And it makes you wonder, must cities like Milwaukee resign themselves to an ever bleaker future? And of all the cities we could be talking about today, we're in Milwaukee, which is not just any post-industrial Midwestern city. This is a city of aberrational extremes. At the peak of the industrial economy in the last century, that was in the 1970s, Milwaukee, by some metrics, was the best city to find an industrial job. That's documented. That was a different time, a simpler time, but in the decades that followed, no other city, certainly not among the 50 biggest cities that you can measure, by a whole raft of measures, fell as far and as fast and as forcefully as the economy in the urban center of Milwaukee. I hope you can see that. This slide appeared in the print version of our story, so it's kind of static and simple. On one side, on the left, is 1970, and the dark red patches show census tracts with poverty that's so concentrated that sociologists will tell you that it has this like combustion effect and it perpetuates by itself after a certain point. And then 2014, you could see what's happened. On the right, the dark blue is shows employment levels basically on a par with the Great Depression or worse. I hope you can see this. So in the online version, I want to show this because we made a motion graphic, which I couldn't duplicate, but I made some screenshots and sort of pasted them. So that's 1970, 1980, and this is the poverty census tracts. 1990, 2000, and 2014, and you get the idea. We called it a slow motion shockwave, but the point is clear. the unemployment and poverty and all the distress that goes with it has continued to spread unrelentingly and hasn't stopped. By the way, we offer equivalent online motion graphics for Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland just to show that Milwaukee's not the only city in the country by any measure. But this city did morph from one of the best to one of the most socially distressed and economically dysfunctional. And my job, as Tim said, using evidence-based findings, was to make sense of these dynamics. And like many, I began with the premise that what this city needed more than anything was more jobs, or job training, or make-work jobs programs. That's obvious, right? How could that not be correct? There's a whole body of urban sociologists who have correlated the collapse of the disappearance of jobs to the collapse of social structures. So if it logically stands to reason that if you reintroduce jobs, it'll solve all the problems and make everything just like it used to be again. A full employment economy. But there's a problem with that logic. It turns out to be a flawed premise. It's not even supported by 50 years of evidence. In fact, in Milwaukee and other post-industrial cities, it's really not that hard to find good-paying jobs that go unfilled with decent benefits and free training right in the very midst of communities with high unemployment. It doesn't make any sense in the logical, linear way that economists think. Completely defies conventional wisdom, even though it hasn't changed the thinking of so many politicians, as well-intentioned as that is. There's this aphorism that I hear sometimes: nothing stops a bullet like a job. I used to think that too. But let's be clear. I'm not trying to oversimplify with what I'm about to say any complex issues. No one disputes the quintessential importance of work or the dignity of work, or police, or teachers, or housing. To stop the cycle, there are some who argue in favor of additional prison beds. But none of those have explained the nonstop decline. It wasn't until I began to explore the neighborhoods themselves that I noticed that the talk had changed in recent years among the social workers who are on the front lines. They weren't talking about jobs, not like they used to. Instead, I was hearing an entirely new word: trauma. Neurological trauma. It took me very much by surprise. Suddenly, we weren't talking in wonkish economic terms anymore. We were talking about the medical conditions that are increasingly the focus of brain science. Seemingly so unrelated. We went on from there to document such widespread childhood trauma that it was really nothing short of a full-blown public health epidemic in the urban heart of Milwaukee. Not supply and demand, but something slightly more complicated to deal with, maybe. By the way, another thing that's important to note about these issues is they're not tied to race. They're far more universal, and I'll show some slides on that. We wrote about urban communities where children routinely are exposed to homicide, neglect, abuse, violence, incarceration, alcohol and drugs, as well as gunfire and police sirens. Traumatic shocks to the developing mind, meanwhile, literally can change the architecture of the brain. In preparing this text, I realized that there's so much ground to cover in 45 minutes that I won't be able to even scratch half the data, but I would be really happy to point you in the direction of the stories themselves. They're easy to find online. As Tim mentioned, there's a lot of multimedia and a lot of video, a lot of data. It's called A Time to Heal. It began as 5 parts, published 1 year ago. And we since expanded it with the additional installments that Tim measured, taking the same metrics and the same ideas to other parts, non-urban parts of Wisconsin. By the way, A Time to Heal, the title, those are the 4 most important words in the stories. It's taken from the book of Ecclesiastes and is meant to put the emphasis on healing and recovery and human resilience, and this was crucial, in a project that otherwise honestly comes with so much pain, and economics that literally chronicle a deep depression in both senses of the word. But I chose to call this talk instead the invisible epidemic because until recently, civilian trauma has been statistically unmeasured and therefore hidden, and it's cloaked in taboos and shame and all the secrecy that comes with all the stigma of mental health and family secrets. PTSD, of course, only became a diagnosis in 1980. And then only for military vets. And then you had to wait a decade or 2 or 3 before it was applied to civilians, which also coincided just in the past 2 decades with other advances in brain science, which makes all these findings actually quite recent. But now that the empirical metrics exist, the trauma, once invisible, is now staggeringly toxic and widespread. One striking example. At Emory University in Atlanta, there are researchers who work with local hospitals, and they estimate that a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder would apply to 46% of low-income Atlanta residents. That's nearly half of the inner city of Atlanta. I didn't believe the number. I had to double check. These were credible researchers. I'm as skeptical as anyone, but the data keeps getting revalidated. Practically speaking, the data is really less than 10 years old, but has become an emerging social science unto itself. The data are standardized and they've been carried out in surveys around the world, to the point of being predictive. And this is important. No state, by the way, has carried out more of these surveys than Wisconsin. So I had the opportunity in my stories to use the nation's best raw data, not just in Milwaukee, but for the other stories that went and looked at the rural parts of the state, upstate. Normally, the term PTSD brings to mind combat veterans or Syrian refugees. This new school of researchers have found that civilian PTSD and military PTSD don't really differ fundamentally in the symptoms that manifest, except for one key difference. For every soldier who serves in a war zone, there are 10 children in the United States endangered in their own homes. One is more prevalent than the other. The children who grow up in adverse conditions tend to see the world as a danger-ridden place, threatening, anxiety-inducing environments. The symptoms, by definition, are unbearable and intolerable, and it gives me no joy to list them, but it helps make the point. Sleep disorders, flashbacks, cold sweats, hallucinations, emotional numbness, dissociation, inconsolable crying, panic and anxiety that's so chronic that it strains the human physiology so severely that it can weaken the immune system and lead to later life heart and physical health conditions. There's a form of numbness, and for the students here, you've probably heard of it, alexithymia. Sorry. But anyways, it's like you're so numb for your own emotions that you don't even connect to them and understand what they're trying to tell you. It's a very vacuous way, I think, to live life. It's sad to think about. Finally, developmental trauma increases the likelihood of depression, mental illness, homelessness, addictions, incarceration, and suicide. And yet, the scars are always invisible. This pain, in turn, too often leads to coping mechanisms, which can be difficult for outsiders to relate to or understand. They usually appear criminal or deviant, but in fact, trauma researchers will just tell you that these are survival and coping mechanisms. Like any epidemic, childhood trauma has measurable costs and consequences. People growing up with developmental trauma have trouble finding and holding a job. Bringing it back to economics. On costs, I'm not even going to mention what this does in terms of fiscal strains to the nation's taxpayer-funded medical and incarceration programs have to bear. But I will say that unemployment and economic anxiety and post-traumatic stress are all factors that are interrelated and self-reinforcing. They create a dynamic that worsens and spreads from generation to generation as children become the parents, and they often go from neighborhood to neighborhood. There's a lot of science behind that last statement. And I'm in a university setting, and normally we delve into the science and into the empiricals and into the data and into the abstracts, but I don't have time for that. Suffice it to say that this is a synthesis of genetic science. You can Google it, epigenetics, or the FKBP5 gene, brain science, social science. But it all boils down to an invisible epidemic that helps drive a downward spiral that feeds on itself. And a workforce that's unprepared and uncompetitive, which is a horrible burden to carry into the raw competition of the global economy of the 21st century. Milwaukee has to compete with one hand tied behind its back, sort of, you could say. Of course, economic change in the 21st century, if anyone remembers what happened in 2008 and 2009 when everyone was hanging on by their fingernails, shows that economic change now moves faster than ever and affects more people than ever. What's more, and this actually took me a long time to understand, it's that persistent generational dynamic. This phenomenon has its own school of researchers. They gave it a name, intergenerational trauma. Some call it the ripple effect. The easier way for me to understand it is to say that in Milwaukee, in the view of the trauma researchers, the seeds of distress that are apparent today actually were planted years ago, when the current generation of adults were children. And they say the new seeds are being planted right now, as we're sitting here. What fascinated me was that these dynamics are so universal. They've been documented by academics in places that are completely unrelated to the American inner city. Some of these images will make you flinch. They've been documented in the children of Nazi Holocaust survivors, children of Vietnam veterans, Chairman Mao's bloody cultural revolution in China, the Cambodian genocide, atomic bomb survivors in Japan, the forced displacement and assimilation of Native American culture in the United States. And then there's actually a vast body of research into the historical trauma. You have to go back a few more generations. to what some call the post-traumatic slave syndrome that gets carried down. As an American, it's like hard for me to accept some of these things because it's supposed to work the other way around. The American dream means that one generation improves on the next. It's not supposed to shift into reverse like this. And I never thought I'd be saying this in a serious academic setting, but I'm about to quote Oprah Winfrey. Thank you, Tim. Yes, she did read our series, and yes, she did come to Milwaukee, and yes, she did talk to the same people we talk to. And yes, she did grow up in this city, and she grew up with her share of abuse, and she actually knows firsthand what she's talking about. And she did cover all the bases. She talked to the thought leaders like Tim Grove and Bruce Perry, and the resilient people, and concluded that standard solutions like jobs and job training will never address a problem that's fundamentally neurological. In her words, quote, "Unless you fix the trauma, literally change the way brains operate, you're working on the wrong thing," unquote. I need to add a word about the metrics very quickly. The most widely used metric that you'll find for trauma exposure is called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Many of you, I'm sure, already know it. 10 really simple questions, 10 really blunt questions. I'm so blunt, I'm always amazed that this data even exists, and certainly even exists in a standardized way around the world. Who would answer these questions? When you were growing up, did a parent or adult in the house beat you? Did they beat each other? Verbally or sexually abuse you? Emotionally ignore you? Were they alcoholic, drug users, incarcerated, or mentally ill? And then here's where the metrics come in, and I'll just go through a few of them, but they're very consistent. Compared to someone with 0 yes answers, a person with 4 or more is 6 times more likely to grow up with depression, 7 times more likely to grow up alcoholic, 10 times more likely to inject street drugs, when you think about the current heroin epidemic, and 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. Elevated ACE scores are tied very closely to heart disease and cancer and a lower life expectancy. In Milwaukee, this kind of sobering thing is that we looked at neighborhoods where 4+ ACE scores was the norm, not the exception. We used ACE data as a hybrid of economics and brain science, which amount to a new metric of social distress, because they always spike amid economic shock and chronic uncertainty. Anything from a farm foreclosure in rural Wisconsin to a suburban layoff for an alcoholic breadwinner. And in the follow-up package of stories that Tim mentioned, we used the same metrics, all the same metrics that we used in the minds of some to tar and feather the image of Milwaukee. And we applied them to the underclass in rural Wisconsin, and we showed, well, here, I'll show you what they showed. The dark red counties have the highest 4+ ACE scores. The 10 counties in Wisconsin with the highest ACE scores are not the urban counties of Milwaukee, Racine, and Kenosha. They are rural counties with slow growth or no growth or dysfunctional job loss, job hemorrhaging economies. In fact, the rural small town underclass has an uncanny resemblance to its urban counterpart. Here, the dark red counties have the highest incidences as a share of the population for childhood poverty. Here, the dark red counties have the highest concentrations of the working poor, people who just literally live paycheck to paycheck. No savings for college or health care. These are single-parent households. Now we're on to drug use. These are opioid-related hospitalizations, people who are overdosing. Rock County down here, it's the highest. And this is the saddest one. This is very clean data. It's from hospitals themselves who have to fill out the paperwork. These are babies that are born with heroin in their baby bodies. I don't know if it reproduces very well, but it makes the North Woods very different from the bucolic kind of image that we have of it. And these are important because we're all meant to believe that this is an urban problem. So using ACE data, using trauma data, it has a way of changing conventional thinking. In the past, the basic premise always was for the juvenile justice official or the school disciplinarian to ask, usually with exasperation, what's wrong with you? Trauma researchers speak a whole different language, and they begin with a different premise and they ask, what happened to you? And those questions, by the way, are often considered the first steps towards some kind of recovery. Someone asked me about what happened. I can talk about it. I saved the rest to talk about the rest of the time to talk about resilience and recovery. All the brain science has created yet another body of researchers into resilience. What is human resilience? Kind of hard to define. I think it's a work in progress, but it seems very important. The military looks at this. Pharmaceutical companies look at this. But the resilient ones are somehow drawing strength from their past hardship. And they manage to see their struggles as the foundations for later success. Many put Oprah Winfrey into that category. They're like alchemists who turn poverty and abuse and absent parents and alcoholism and violence into what could be called post-traumatic growth or post-traumatic healing. Our series introduced the readers to some of the most remarkable and resilient people I've ever met or could imagine meeting. That's Jamila. In a project that had no jokes in it, she cracked the only one. Her ACE score is 10. And she said, what? You've never seen a perfect 10 before? But it wasn't even funny, in a way, because what she meant was, there are a lot like me with 10 in Milwaukee. You think 4 being a standard was enough. So these are the people who's walked the journey, and therefore they become the teachers. And I learned a lot about resilience from them. That's Belinda. She is one of the great healers. Oprah spent a lot of time with her on camera as well. And what I learned, these remarkable people do not appear blameful or bitter. Amazingly, they don't call themselves victims. Of all the people who have a right to complain, they complain the least of any people I know, amazingly. They can talk openly about their own emotions so they're not numbed out. They often end up finding a vocation or a calling in life where they have some purpose, helping others, going through the same thing. They become counselors, therapists, activists, or researchers, and turn their past problems into new and productive purpose. That is the amazing Alicia Fox, ACE score 9. Horrific story. And now an exemplar of resilience. And there's some proof that these stories have happy endings. She once told me that one of the people she admired is Oprah Winfrey. Tenacity and grit seem to be an important part of resilience. But they don't tell the whole story. For many healers, recovery, and I've heard this so often that I'm just repeating to you like this anecdote that just keeps coming at me. Recovery comes down to a conscious, deliberate, like step-by-step mental process that they have to go through themselves. They have to think themselves healthy. They have to make a new story in their own minds about their whole life and integrate all the bad stuff that happened to them, but make a happy ending in their own life. It's like they have to create new patterns of thought that they believe. And for the layperson, many people call it re-scripting. Learning to tell one's own new story to themselves about their lives in a way that's believable. New outlooks, new dreams, new aspirations. For some, a reason to be. I'll finish up on time with one last anecdote, which I've been saving for the end. It's a remarkable example in my mind of resilience and re-scripting and recovery. But to tell this final anecdote, I'm going to invoke a stereotype, a crass, crude stereotype. I'm going to use it precisely to show how useless stereotypes can be, particularly when examining a human phenomenon that's obviously so universal. So, having forewarned, this is the story of a single mother living in a subsidized apartment in a large city who was unemployed, poor, on welfare, clinically depressed by her own admission to the point of being suicidal, even as she raised a child by herself. Using those attributes, this woman would be absolutely unremarkable in the statistical profile of Milwaukee or cities like it. Can't even count people like her. But this particular stereotypical recipient of welfare checks re-scripted her life in a way that proved inspirational. Her new story had its share of hardship and aces and death, but what was very clever, she gave her depression a new and creative name. She called it a dementor. And she described it in the most awful terms. Dark, soul-sucking, foul and filthy. She also wrote about a young man with a high ACE score who mastered an imaginative coping skill, which involved summoning a guardian from his imagination called a Patronus. It never actually killed the Dementors, but made them go away. The stereotypical welfare mother was, of course, J.K. Rowling. And the ending to her story is well known. But Rowling, the author, embodies all the attributes of resilience. Apart from the ability to tell a different story, she also doesn't conceal her dark times. She talks disarmingly openly and has become an advocate for mental health, even as she entertained hundreds of millions of people. like the alchemist who turns something dark into something useful. So what makes me interested in this story is that there are people in Milwaukee who have to make she just made magic what people in Milwaukee do every day. This stereotypical story is consistent with all the research in cities like Milwaukee. Milwaukee has endured as much economic and social upheaval as any cities you'll find in the nations in the aftermath of communism. It even looks like them if you happen to have walked through them in 1990, once upon a time like I did. But this city is not a magical fiction. It's gritty and sometimes unglamorous, but it does have remarkably resilient people who can teach the nation something new about what it means to be resilient and recover. So thank you very much.
Take a few questions.
Sure, if you want.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your work. I'm so happy Marquette was able to help contribute to this. The Journal Sentinel supported it. It's such important work. We do have some time for questions. We have a few minutes. If John is willing to answer any questions you have here. Anybody? Yeah, please.
Hi there. I have a question. Do you have any data around people who are undocumented? Because I know a lot of information was collected via hospitals, and oftentimes many clients I work with are undocumented and may not be accessing those resources. So I'm curious to what degree where the data also represent that population.
I think when you say undocumented, you must mean the immigrants who are called illegal immigrants. Am I correct?
I'm using the term just individuals who are not citizens here.
Yeah.
Who have the rights as citizens.
Right. Yes, we did. If you look at our 5-part original series, the 5th part deals with migrations and immigrations. I mean, this country, this city is a city of immigrants. And every new wave of immigrant brought that first generation in. And the cool thing about the generational syndrome with immigrants is that it flips. The people who leave those cities in Mexico so famously riddled with petty corruption and drugs and weak economies and jobs that pay in 7 days what a job in Milwaukee will pay in 1 day, will come up to Milwaukee at risk and start a family and take upon themselves the traumas and the hardships just so that the next generation can have it better. I'm an example. I can document my family going backwards from coming here 100 years ago, from economic, you couldn't even scratch the earth in the part of Europe where my family came from. So my grandmother came over here with less than a high school education, with a grade school education, but to make it work. And my dad became a physician through, the military's scholarship to create doctors to send into war. So, to your question, it is examined. There are books, there are authors. And the language is the same, however. There is a traumatization process. Oh, and if you're a refugee, if you're from Syria, then your ACE scores are off the charts, obviously.
Please.
Thank you very much for being here. It was a very interesting presentation, and your series was remarkable. I am curious about come back to me. Sorry. Oh yeah. That's just something in my mind right now. My question is about how so many of us are either in the mental health field, training to be in the mental health field. And to people who are not in the field, this idea of re-scripting your story can feel somewhat like the onus is on the person themselves to figure it out, to be able to tell a new story, kind of be strong enough to pull yourself up and make a new life. And for those of us in the field, we know so much of it can be about access and making sure there are appropriate professionals who speak your language, or bicultural, all these different things. And so I'm wondering if you have anything to say to kind of the future generation who are training to be professionals. What more do we need to do in the area of access to do this trauma work?
I'm a layman, but that question has a lot in it. In Milwaukee, the chorus that you often hear is that the amount of resources, the amount of therapists, the amount of time those therapists have, or those counselors, or those AODA helpers, is so limited compared to the need that's in this city. Having more of those would be huge. Peer counselors, there were a couple on the slide there who show up and just volunteer just to listen, seem important. Access to have someone to talk to. Wow, where to begin? I would almost turn that question around to the people in this room who are students and faculty. Bob Fox, who, and hopefully that's the question that this city can tackle. Are we out of time?
We have another question in the back there.
Actually, my question was very similar to Dr. Eric's question. Just addressing if you personally see areas that maybe us as like mental health professionals could be addressing with trauma-informed care better, just like in your opinion of like being in the field.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. So I was wondering if, like, from your experiences, if there were specific areas like of trauma and trauma-informed care that like you saw maybe we could be focusing on more, or if maybe we could put our energy into more, like
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. So the trauma-informed idea is still relatively new. It gets, my sense is that it gets talked about a lot right now. There are people in this room who are inventing new applications to bring it. Those ACE surveys are done in welfare offices, jails. And they're moving into really new and interesting parts of society, including job training, that disconnect we talked about. And what is interesting to me is that it's all in the innovation experimental stage right now. But more and more people seem to be talking about it in this city and around the country and around the world. Marquette's looking for pilots. Small stage pilots that can be scaled. I would love to hear what Mike Lovell has on his desk right now in terms of what people are calling him up and proposing to him.
Good. Over here. Got it? Up here.
Can I accept your invitation, John, to respond to the earlier question?
Yeah, that'd be great, Tim. This is Tim Grove. He's a thought leader in the community.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. So,
Also on Oprah.
our community right now is struggling with all these good questions and trying to figure out sort of good, innovative ways to answer them. And I think what's most exciting for me, who's been thinking about this for now going on 11 years and primarily practicing on the child welfare side, is there are new, unique ways to solve problems. But I'm going to make a bit of a biased push here. Maybe it's sort of echoing what John said. We will not solve the scope of this problem by formal intervention alone. It will not happen. We cannot, in my humble opinion, scale up enough clinicians, enough mental health professionals to solve this problem Not sort of because there's not the resources, but also because there are dynamics in that way of exclusively solving the problem that are a challenge. So we play a role, as do many others, I'm looking at Terry and others in the room, in building capacity where there aren't access issues. So just to be clear about that, if I'm one of these young kids and my brain has been wired in a certain way, when my teacher approaches me with the truth about what happened to me, that's the beginning of re-scripting. That's almost what the clinician is doing in their 50-minute session Thursday afternoon at 6. So I think there's also a call for professionals to be part of that collaborative movement to gear up sort of the non-professionals of the world, Boys and Girls Club staffers, neighborhood center staffers, people in mosques and synagogues and churches, to recognize that their interaction with people who've experienced trauma also has potential to heal. How do we collaboratively support that kind of process and movement? And that's kind of the field that is being invented as we speak. What is the technology? What's the empirical evidence? And the last thing I would say before I sit down is this is not a sort of anti-intervention message. We need to do it collaboratively. There is a value to both caring for people in this way and intervening professionally in this way. And I know there's a trauma-informed architect in the room, also designing spaces and culture and process that reinforce these messages too. So.
Who's that person?
Paul should stand up. That's Paul Alt. He's an architect from Chicago.
And what is trauma-informed architecture?
Healing environments. So architecture is a tool for healing programming. So I've worked with for 25 years inner city school children, veterans, and active military.
Oh, terrific, thank you. We have time for another question, anyone? If not, once more, let's thank John Schmid. Thank you very much.